So thanks, thanks for the invitation to come over here and show at least a bit of the work that we carry out in the office. As Ivan said, it's a bit difficult to talk for another 45 minutes or 1 hour about architecture, having spoken about it for the whole day and thought, and to have a look at yet more projects. But I'll try to keep my, let's say, talk very brief. As Ivan said, with Matija Beuk, my partner, we work for already, I think, quite a few years, already 13 or 14 years. And we run an office in Ljubljana. And when Marie-Cécile from A+ was asking me about, if I could give a title, or if I could give a title to this talk. Well, the thing that just emerged over Skype was the idea of this of talking about the conditions, or talking about this little quote, which is a misappropriation of a Miesian quote from the late 1920s. Where the idea of conditions in which an architect has to work, in his text, of course, referred to the idea of the developments of technology and the need for an architectural project or an architect to kind of comprehend and take it all in and transform it into a kind of a new quality. I think that the idea of conditions in our time has become much wider and much more complex and much more difficult to comprehend. It encompasses all the things that were the obsessions of the 80s or 90s of the kind of early or late postmodernism, of the ideas of context and whatever, but it encompasses also much more than that. The condition of Slovenia is a new condition for myself, because I actually moved there. I never lived there before in my life, before the day we opened the office. It's also just one of the things that determines our work, and it's, as you know, or as you may not know, a very fresh country. It's in 3 days it's going to be 20 years old for the first time in history. And the capital of Ljubljana is a mix of Baroque and whatever modernism, and in that sense defines, at least to a certain point, also the work we carry out. The position of Slovenia in this Google universe, you can see basically the cultural space that has been surrounding us for the past few centuries, and you can see that the circle of 300 kilometers will give you the complexity of the cultural and whatever national overlaps that have been happening in this region over time. The split that exists in Belgium and is very pronounced, split exists also in Slovenia, but to a lesser extent. The split between Protestant regions and regions that are more Catholic, or the split between the Mediterranean influences and Germanic influences, is also not as visible and not as pronounced, but definitely exists and defines what we do. If any of you have ever been there, you have probably been told that Slovenia has a fantastic landscape. Not that we managed to enjoy it a lot, but it is in fact the most wooded country of Europe. It also does have some specific expressions of architecture which have emerged over centuries there. This is the haystacks, which are somewhere near the Bohinj Lake, which are the constructions, house-like constructions of which you dry hay. It also does have all the things that I think most of Belgians are very familiar with, the destruction that happened in the 70s. Despite the fact that Slovenia was part of the former Yugoslavia and therefore nominally pronounced as a socialist country or as a kind of a Ostblock by a lot of people. In fact, the destruction we shared despite the different, seemingly different political systems. It is also the place where a character of an architect, which I think is not the case in Belgium, and maybe the only comparable country in Europe would be Finland with Aalto, where the person of an architect is completely embedded into the idea of national culture. Jože Plečnik, whose project you're looking at, was a Slovene architect, the only guy who appeared on the main banknote, while we still did not have the generic euro, but also an architect who was a student of Wagner and came and practically constructed Ljubljana the way you see. This is his project, the first project that has Slovene in its name. It's Slovene National Library in Ljubljana. The scope of his work was enormous, and the scope of his influence is therefore also enormous on everything that we do. I'm not going to refer to it. I'm sounding more like a tourist guide at the moment, but I think it's kind of an important a few references that I want to put forward, because I don't think you are aware of them. his attempt to create this kind of a merger of pan-Slavic and also at the same time pan-European style is very visible in this thing, because you can trace influences of everything from Leverens to the Byzantine churches. This is a service building for the cemetery of Žale, where you dry the wood on top and then you make the caskets at the bottom. Slovenia also had a kind of a very strong modernist influence, mainly students of Plečnik. This is Edward Ravnikar, a student of Plečnik who went to work for Corbusier and came back to Ljubljana, became a communist and built most of the stuff in the 1960s. And these are the two skyscrapers which were built. One of them was supposed to house the Communist Party. Now it houses the biggest Slovene bank, which in turn is owned by KBC of Belgium. It was never finished, so just as the idea, modernism is an unfinished project for Slovenes and for most parts of Europe, communism is as well an unfinished project, and also these two buildings are an unfinished project of this guy. Of course, the architecture has a kind of permanence that defies even the biggest political changes, and in that sense, the same two buildings are the background for this party to celebrate the European Union ascension of Slovenia. There are a series of very quiet architectures in Slovenia that have influenced our work much more than the things that I've shown before, and this is one of those. This is Otto Njugovec, an architect who only built 6 or 7 buildings, and this is a structure which preserves the archaeological excavations somewhere in the fields on the border in between Slovenia and Croatia, where I think this attempt to merge the regional expression with the radicality of a modernist structure is pretty apparent. But at the same time, the way this building looks, or at least looked a few months ago, before now we were doing with some friends, we were raising money to put it up again. But it also gives you the idea, maybe a bit metaphorical, of the relation that Slovenia has to architecture. You should not get the impression that Slovenia is the country, the proudest land for architects. We have had very difficult times, and we still have very difficult times, and in fact, nobody is really interested in what we do there. In that sense, now I'm stopping my tourist guidance or my advertising for your next holidays. But I'm just trying to explain a little bit what happened when I moved from Amsterdam and ended up in Slovenia, which is definitely important. The condition of our office, we are in a relatively small office, we are 12 or 13 people, and we live, well, no, we don't live, we work in a factory space, one of the few factory spaces, because Slovenia was never very industrial, and it's an old tobacco factory. The condition of our partnership, my partner is 7 years younger, that's not the zebra, but this guy. Matija is 7 years younger, he is Slovene. Together we have been, let's say, with another 12 or 13 people working for the past 10 years on some projects. We have started with a project of a school many years ago. This is a school in Kočevje. This is a region 80 kilometers from Ljubljana, where basically, on this project is where we met, but this is the attempt of this building was to construct a very rough concrete building somewhere in the landscape in the middle of the forest. So we were basically trying to clear the forest and use the wood obtained in order to cast the spaces of the new school. We were also trying to show the idea of, let's say, the bizarre programs of the Ministry of Education, where you see that all of this concrete, the building is exclusively constructed of concrete, there is no other material used. So all the partition walls are at the same time also structural walls, so it's a very kind of attempt to, let's say, defy the rules of logic within the structure and relate them directly to the program. A small pavilion that we built for a 30s villa somewhere in Ljubljana. It's like a fence, semi-sunken pavilion, which it was an early attempt, it's also a very old project, to kind of create something that would be productively sustainable in summer. The southern elevations get overgrown and in a sense protect themselves without too much technology. Or the individual houses, which is something that we actually strive and we like working on a lot. And the first one of those was, in fact, not really very private, because this is a residence for the Dutch ambassador, and it was part of this big program where the Netherlands decided to promote its presence in Europe or in the world through architecture. The most notable example, of course, was the OMA in Berlin. But we did a residence where the residence, these three gray boxes are the three structural columns, in fact, three service spaces that support the private residence of the ambassador on top, which is then this wooden structure which basically rests on the spaces that are used for parties at the bottom of the building. You might have seen this not sketch, but this building. This is also a condition of Slovenia. We work in the very anomalous conditions. This change from a socialist to a capitalist regime, I would say, happened practically overnight. So you have all these anomalies of ownership. So we were asked by the University of Ljubljana to construct the new university building on top of the building that existed from the 50s, which is completely privately owned in a kind of a separate deal. We were using the air rights from an old building permission. Therefore, the School of Mathematics sits on top of another building, literally, and basically only has a pod to connect it to the world below, to the city. So, because all of the public spaces in the buildings are the only unregulated areas of the project, because nobody cares what the public spaces are. So they are the transparent bits that basically try to communicate back to the city from the building and try to establish a condition of a kind of a public building with the things that you would expect to have on the ground floor happening on the third floor. We have done this exercise a few times, also in the housing projects. This is a housing project in Maribor for social housing. This is the first project that we were doing, actually, the Office for Social Housing, because at that time nobody really wanted to do it. It was considered too low budget. And Slovenia, despite the change of the regime, still kept all the social programs. So we tried to, in a very condensed situation, convince the client that we can put all the apartments and still have some children's playgrounds carved into a building because it didn't have any outside space. And they appear as this kind of spaces, either open air or closed within the structure of the building. Or a recent project where next to a medieval city in an old industrial land, somewhere 20 kilometers from Ljubljana, we constructed housing last year for young families. This is the condition of those buildings basically from November to April. So I think that this is a perfectly valid photograph, but also sometimes there's also sun shining. So basically, the construction is extremely simple because the whole thing, another anomaly of Slovenia, had to be designed over a period of 2 months. Therefore, we basically have the continuous balcony surrounding the spaces of the apartments, and then a very thin, practically skin of perforated metal, which closes the entire building and allows for together with the curtains, for the spaces to be closed. We have recently started working also on a few projects in Croatia and some other countries. I'm going to show some of them. And this is a small weekend house that we designed as an extension to an old 18th century captain's house on the island of Silba, where we practically added a pavilion in white concrete, which doesn't have any walls or doesn't have any glass walls, so practically creates just a kind of a shelter in the condition of this Mediterranean garden, kind of open air rooms. I'm not going to go into details with all these projects. I'm just going to show maybe the thing that we are working on at the moment, a small project for the suburbia of Prague in Czech Republic, where we are trying to disperse, in this kind of suburban condition, to disperse the programs of the house into a series of rooms with their own programmatic definitions, like all the bedrooms, where the living spaces are the spaces that are this kind of continuous and connecting spaces of the unit. Or another project that I just took off the desk the other day, or Radim actually took it off the desk, an extremely steep slope somewhere near Bled. We are overlooking Bled Lake, which is another scenic spot of Slovenia. We're trying to actually submerge the house into the mountain and recarve out the mountain in a kind of an attempt to create a slit which will open with the views towards the lake, and the very small box on top contains only 2 bedrooms. Also, currently we are trying to work on a project which was hit by this our common crisis. A project for an office complex in Klagenfurt in Austria, a competition we won already 2 years ago. A series of 3 villas existing in between an old monumental tower, which is protected as from the 18th century tower, and a highway, and with beautiful views of the lake. Where the idea of this anonymous office space, rentable office space, which basically is this kind of generic program for which it is very difficult to find an expression, becomes the idea of one office having its own window protruding out of the building, so that the overall effect of the building in this kind of polished golden metal would be the one of a kind of a pine cone, where every single employee would have his own view of the outside world. And then also pretty recently we are quite proud of this project because we didn't do a project. We renovated the Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana. This is the first project of the architect Ravnica that I showed you, these 2 skyscrapers. See, it's from the 1930s. It was built as an art pavilion, and it was built on and it's protected, of course, as a monument. And the initial plan of the architect was this. He tried to actually create this empilade for this of rooms and the movement through these spaces. And over years, it was completely covered with storage spaces and stuff like that. And what we did is we basically said that we want our work not to be visible to the people that have never been in a museum. So we want them to enter the building and basically see the building as if the original architect thought of renovating it. So what we cleaned all the walls and all the additions, and we basically added the core, a service core on top over there, and created this completely open platform for the museum, which is, of course, still until the new contemporary art museum is finished, the only place where you can see all the contemporary art exhibitions. So basically, in the museum you see that it looks as if nothing has been designed until you come to the basement, where we basically, for the additional program, had to dig the basements of the museum. So this becomes obvious. This is the only part of the project that you actually see, are these boxes that are sunken into the ground and that contain, in this case, a cafe, or lecture hall, or all the storage spaces. These boxes in concrete, these new foundations of the building, in fact, integrate also all the techniques of the building. So basically, the building is completely intact, and everything is hidden in its new structural addition. In this new condition, we work actually quite a lot also, or we have worked quite a lot with artists, and this is the setup of an exhibition that we are now trying to instruct the people how to use the building. So this is an exhibition of contemporary Slovene art, which we did with Charles Escher from the Van Abbe Museum, or the exhibition that is now currently going on of Arctic projects of Marko Pelhan, an artist who lives and works in California, but actually works mainly in the Arctic, for which we did the layout of his show. So basically, what I think, what I wanted to say with this is that sometimes we also felt that it was quite important not to do any projects, or not to really try to express ourselves in a project like that. We have another anomalous condition. We have done this student housing in relatively, well, it looks very suburban in this picture, but it's actually quite near the center of Ljubljana. We have done it some years ago, and the student housing was also designed just before the elections, because of course the politicians needed some votes from the students. So we basically won a competition and had to design the entire building in a period of 2.5 months. So we basically did the writing. We were writing the tender documents and not looking really at the site anymore. Although the site is a relatively anonymous patch of land with some buildings that are to be demolished, and standing next to this beautiful project from the 90s, the concrete school of Jurikovi, which is kind of a medical school. So we designed the building over a super short period, therefore forcing us to think in terms of very efficient organization. So we basically organized student housing in the sense that the pancake on the ground floor became all the public communal spaces of the building, and on top we had 4 thin slabs of student rooms which completed the whole complex. The ground floor in essence contains only the structure, and all the partition walls are then in glass, so that there is no clear hierarchy of the programs, so that basically all the programs are treated in the same way, including the exterior spaces of them. And on top, there are just these 4 very simple slabs joined by communications which are used for student housing. The complete ground floor is clad in glass, irrespective of the fact whether it covers the structure or whether the glass is actually see-through. And then all the upper floors are clad in a kind of a system of paneling which allows for manipulation, opening and closing. The central courtyard, which of course in condition of Slovenia, in Belgium we can still smoke in the bars, but we for already 10 years cannot smoke anywhere, so this has become the smoking space, but also the communal open air workspace. For the building, and all the public or all the communal spaces on the ground floor basically connect freely throughout all the spaces. So, for example, this is a bicycle storage. That's a learning space. So they're all connected and treated equally in the organizational model of the grounds. You go through the very black corridors, and you end up in student units. And the student units are. We were asked to do a very, very diverse set of units, and we said, well, diversity is basically in use, not in architectural conception. So diversity is that we have 2 rooms. We eliminated all the corridors. We have 2 rooms, a central prefab core with the bathroom and all the stuff, kitchen and stuff. And then the rooms are actually used as communication. So this is the worst condition with 4 students, but you could also have the same thing for the couple with a small living space, or invalid student with a helping person next door, whatever. And all of those people that will live in the unit will meet on this front piece, which is the dining room, which is the center of the unit. The center of the unit will have a kind of a communication with the outside world, and these are these big TV sets, as we put them, which basically are just radiators covered up to a certain point and protruding out of the elevation towards the views of the city. Where the private space of the balcony, you would be able to manipulate it, and this would be really something that every student can do for himself. I think this idea actually caught on quite well, that this projection of domestic life of the student unit is working quite well, and this was given to me by some visitors on the project, and there are many more, much more explicit slides of the same situation, but it goes on and on. So in a sense, this is what we were trying to do, and trying to actually make building, in a way, the central space communicate with the city, where the other spaces are the spaces that you can, as control your own privacy. So this building was finished, I think, maybe 4 years ago, and it's one of the series of buildings that I would just generally put under the idea of housing. And this is when I talk about collective housing, and there have been quite a few housing projects, also a Belgian housing project that we saw today. This is something that we put forward once to a client, and a client almost had a heart attack. But we were trying to at least tame the idea of some sort of participation, or some sort of identification that a particular user can have with his or her own unit, or the kind of freedom or that is expected of the client and not provided, of the client, I mean of the buyer of the unit, and not provided by an architect or by a developer. Of course, this project, even this was not really a project, this was a proposal to a client. When he had a heart attack, this was very quickly dismissed. But this idea of the establishing potential for the establishment of the individual presence within a collective form of housing is something that has been present in a lot of our projects. Anomalous condition number 1 million of Slovenia is that, in fact, you have a lot of urban plans which have been designed, I would say. I don't think this is really designed, but which have been put into action in 1980s or 1970s, and they still remain today. And the urban planning is basically stuck somewhere in between being, let's say, a law, an idea of a law, and is very, very far from being a flexible design tool to make our cities better. So this is a competition that we started working on, and we thought we were doing something in the center of the city, because obviously this urban planner was influenced by IBA exhibition in Berlin in the 1980s, because this is when the plan dated. And when we went to see the site, it's basically in the middle of nowhere, and it's completely the last 6 buildings of the city. So to design social housing on these kind of areas, of course, social housing always happens on a fringe, and you cannot expect to have a very sexy location in the city center and somebody tells you to do social housing, and that is not in Slovenia. The whole project became, because social housing is so terribly regulated, but again, it's terribly regulated in the control of the built spaces, of the interior spaces, not so much on the control of the exteriors. So the whole manipulation became the manipulation of the existing urban plan in order to create a kind of a condition of a continuous living space for all the units on the outside of this settlement. Because the apartments are super regulated, so you practically have to have 6 kids in order to get a 3-bedroom apartment. Most of these people are going to be outside anywhere, most of these kids are going to be outside. So we created this kind of a communal space, which overlaps people of different, or kids of different generations with the elderly. So there is a kind of a feeling of joint existence on a general surface, which has some sort of programmatic definitions in between. And I think that this, despite the fact that all my pictures I see now are totally empty, actually works quite well. The apartments are very banal. They are just a prefab bathroom and and 1 or 2 bedrooms, depending on how big a family you are. And therefore, the idea, or the only possibility of going out of this urban plan is to push the balcony, so that at least these claustrophobic units could have some sort of the outside space, which is in turn then communicating, or let's say at least trying to remind one of the railways nearby. So this iconography of the railways exists still in this suspension of the prefab elements of the terrace. And these terraces are indeed protruding completely out of the building and giving you the idea of the open space that you can experience. The buildings, the elevation, so that there you see the manipulation with the balconies, and here you see what the urban planners want, and here at the bottom you see the open, completely open elevation. So we try to create a building as a kind of a condition which would change as you turn around the building, so that there would never be a single perception, this kind of a monumental perception of a volume of the building, but every time you turn around the building it would try to defy your expectations. So you have 4 different elevations. And then we were also trying to imagine this, as architects you always strive to make the things absolutely perfect. And the idea of making the building seem like a solid piece is something that you always strive for. You would like everything to have no seams and be completely one big thing of material. So we said, why not try to actually give expression to a material in the sense that the way you put the material on the facade will become its expression. So that the first thing that you would see on this building would be the screw that you screwed these large panels with. We used the industrial size of the panels, so we never cut any panels except when we get to the last one, and this was the instruction to do it. And we did this 8-centimeter diameter kind of underlayers for the screws, which basically creates this accidental ornamental condition on the building, where all put all together, of course, it looks something like this. So this is one of these elevations. This is the other one where the roof starts looking like a kind of a Second World War monument. Or the third one, when the buildings are basically facing the open fields around the city of Ljubljana, and where they look like some sort of sentinels guarding the city. Of course, the central space is something that you always refer back to, and the central space is something that we always somehow acts really as the communal living room for the whole neighborhood. The way you see the buildings, if you're approaching Ljubljana on the railways from Croatia, would be something like this. So, in a sense, I think that We have, of course, I don't even have to mention that the budgets in Slovenia for social housing are probably, not probably, but 30 or 40% less than Belgium. So, of course, this kind of execution, this kind of projects took a lot of manipulation. We are still working on a few of them, although Slovenia, unfortunately, is catching up with the European Union very quickly, so all the prices are rising and there's less and less possibility to basically do something within the context of social housing anymore. We do also projects outside of Slovenia in terms of housing. And we try to at least work on in a way on what we think would be something that reacts also to the conditions of the locality where we work. This is a project for Basel. On the edge, on the border of the Rhine, you see the red dot over there, and behind the red dot you see somewhere on the left-hand side of the red dot you see the skyscraper of Monte Zegolo, which is where Messe Basel is, and on the right-hand side you may see, yes, the white tower of Salzburg, which is the complex of Hoffmann-la-Roche. Yes, Hoffmann-la-Roche, where this skyscraper, famous skyscraper of Herzog Nemeron was supposed to be. So in this kind of condition, you have a super, let's say, combination of a very luxurious rental housing and ownership housing on the riverbank. And it replaces the children's hospital, which existed there, which has this kind of series of courtyards. It's a very lousy building, but it has a series of courtyards which define this kind of interior conditions of the city block. So in this kind of condition, we actually proposed a very banal snake-like shape, which basically starts from being seemingly respectful towards the neighboring lines given by the urban planners, but at the same time is lifted completely into, above the ground and tries to create a condition of a continuous public space that goes through the city block. The curve that we propose also gives, on top you see it, gives definition. I'm trying to find this thing, but no. Gives definition to the programmatic structure. So you see that the line in the back is going to divide the units into rental and units that you can buy, because when you buy units, you're probably 6-7 years old and you have a lot of money, and you need a large living room and less bedrooms. And when you rent a unit, you're probably 35 and you probably have 1 or 2 kids, so you need more bedrooms and less living rooms. So this curve allows you to reorganize the programmatic structure of the building in a sense to provide for different kinds of users in the same volume. The building is indeed a kind of attempt to marry, let's say, a Swiss structural precision with the frivolity of Brazil. So in the sense, it's a huge concrete beam. You see the steel cables or the steel columns which connect the bottom piece of concrete with the top piece of concrete. So it's a continuous beam that hovers and stands only on the main structure are the staircases of the building. So in a sense, you create a kind of completely open space that goes in between through the city block. So this is something. This is what it looks like, and I think this was the main complaint of the owners and the clients, that it's too public. And the ground floors are completely open, with only some places closed for the communal spaces for the users. The upper floors, where you see that the back bedrooms, the back apartments will have more bedrooms in the back and less living rooms, and vice versa in front. So that this partitioning, so this is the how we explain the structure, the system which supports the building, which in turn and which kind of curves creates also these continuous balconies, and also a support system for the glass elevation. So the glass elevation, which in turn also moves a bit like a curtain, like the curtains that cover the building, and creates spaces for storages alongside the elevations. Well, I'm not going to comment on this anymore. So I was trying to show you maybe also how conditions of work in different countries with different budgets, and may result in also very different approaches to the projects, depending on, let's say, on how we work. And this is what I thought was an interesting subject for Belgium, because, and I have been proven right, because we have seen an enormous selection of private houses today in this jury. So I think this has become, well, I think the renovation and the individual house is something that Belgium is full of. Slovenia is also going more or less in that direction, and this diagram is something that we use very often to try to explain, at least in a very simplistic and simplified way, the changes that we feel have occurred in the idea of habitation in the last, in the last maybe 50 years. So the idea of a house as a kind of a model of protection from the outside world has has started eroding and has functions in a slightly different way. And we tried to do this already in the first project that we did. This is the house that we did for an engineer who works for us, a very modest family. Who actually runs our building sites now, but this was his test project, his own house, which is on in the typical Slovene suburban condition. These buildings have all been illegally built in the 1970s, because there was this attempt of at that time, a socialist government to allow a certain freedom and to accommodate for the wish of people to have their own place. So in a sense, there were a lot of people who were building these houses over the weekends. So now these houses have become a context. So this has become, if you go to the local Gemeente and you ask, what should I build there? They tell you, oh, you should build something like the neighbors did. This site is very small and it has a wonderful view of the forest, but this view is towards the north, and of course it will never have the sun. The site looks something like this, so these are our new contextual neighbors. So this is the first day. We always keep the pictures of the first day that we see the site, and this was accidentally or during the New Year's holiday some years ago. So we try to take advantage of the site by creating a house which will be its own fence, establish border conditions, try not to fence the house by lifting the ground, and try to rearrange this, whatever, Belgians are very famous for the fermets, but this kind of a model of a suburban dream into something that would probably work slightly more, slightly better for the sites that we had. So we rearranged the existing, or the traditional typology, in the sense that we created a living room on the first floor, as with a kind of a periscope condition where you can skip the ugly neighbor and have the views of the northern forest, but still catch the sun. Where the ground floor condition would be almost like a Japanese ryokan, so a series of very, very small rooms with folding panels which open up, or sliding panels here which open up and in the morning become a communal children's bedroom. And the upper floor would, so this would be a very kind of a claustrophobic and hidden space, where the upper floor would provide this contrast. It would act as a kind of a bridge and become a kind of a loft-like space opening towards the views. So the building is a kind of a little monster, but it also looks like that. Towards the street it has a carport and then catches sun here. You see that all the windows are practically on the ground. They are on the level of the beds, so that you can actually, because this is the main consumption for this floor. We have raised the entire ground to a level of the interior, or to a level of the workspace inside the house, so that we skip the fences all around the site, because the site is too small. And then this is the series of folding and opening screens and doors. These are which basically open up in the morning and allow for the whole space to be used together. The staircase is then used as a kind of a changing element, so from this condition of a compressed space underneath to this loft-like space on the upper floor, which is like a new piece of land, which then basically catches the sun and orients towards the views of the forest outside. So this was I deliberately showed the first house that we designed, because it maybe established a kind of the approach that we have had since. in the sense that we always try to tackle questions that of course relate to the family that is going to use the house, but maybe also very often relate to the fundamental questions that architecture could deal with at this point in time. Another, of course, in Slovenia, like in Belgium, okay, some of the buildings are in the city centers, but most of them are suburban. Top of a small hill, some 10 kilometers out of central Ljubljana. And again, the first day on the site, it's the top of the hill overlooking the small village. It looks something like this on the day when we come to, before we destroy it. The idea or the debate that we had was whether it is possible to let's say, step away from this strange model of domination of land where you throw houses into the fields, or where basically sometimes you stretch them into a kind of something that seems to work with the landscape, but to be maybe a little bit more radical, to maybe create conditions that would at the same time be the one of domination, but on the other hand also, very similar to the other house, provide this feeling of privacy on this top hill. So the house became like a kind of earthwork. So we shifted the entire hill, we put the concrete walls on the side, and we created a replica of the hill inside, so you have a patio condition. The house is like a tent on top, but then there is an underground house, which in this case becomes a new ground floor, which opens up towards its own private space. So this is something like this. Well, of course, it's on a larger scale. I had to cut it for this presentation. And the house basically spans the entire site from end to end and creates this huge patio in the back on the top of the hill, so we carved the entire top. The new ground floor, which opens towards the back, with all the bedrooms and stuff, and then a small or very narrow living room which dominates the upper floor. Very similar to the other house. We again have to follow the idea of a traditional house, so this becomes a kind of a packaging of thermal insulation and aluminium, which basically acts as a tent on a steel structure, whereas the bottom part is constructed in concrete. And the first day that the people moved into their house, we have since, of course, replanted back this orchard that existed here, which we had to demolish for the construction. So the big cut is also now green, but this is the way you enter into your site and enter into the garage. And this is the way you exit from your living room onto the terrace, keeping the traditional shape and having this patio only visible from the back of the building. The conditions of the bottom floor and the conditions of the upper floor are not that different, because in fact we have managed to bring in a lot of sun also into this underground space. And then the living room, this steel and aluminum tent basically sits and overlooks the village conditions around. I deliberately show this house immediately after the previous one, because we somehow feel that they're a natural continuation of the quests that we have been trying to do. And maybe this house is slightly, this house here is slightly different. Ljubljana has become the capital of a new country, and of course there is this very luxurious area very near the city center. We have been asked by friends of ours to design a house for them in this location here. Somewhere here, this is where the president of Slovenia officially lives. But of course this neighborhood doesn't look so lavish. Of course the prices are very lavish, but it's because all the diplomats wanted to move here, but it still is a relatively poor neighborhood, so we were supposed to demolish this building and build a new one there. It was supposed to be a house for friends of ours who don't have any children and who came to us and asked us to do a house which has only one living room and one bedroom. And we said, oh, this is great, finally somebody comes who doesn't have this standard program of, I don't know, whatever people come up with when they start dreaming about their house, and especially if they have at least a little bit of money. So, but then they came to the second meeting and said, yes, but we forgot to tell you that this house has to have a gym, a swimming pool, a workspace, a music room, a library, and this kind of enormous amount of program which none of the normal houses ever has. So we said the only good thing about their location was that they actually bought a location which borders on no one's land. This is a biotope that the city of Ljubljana is protecting, so you basically cannot do anything there, and it's going to remain like that forever. So it's going to be the patch of nature caught in the city, and this is our site. So we said, okay, well, with this kind of program, we have to fill in the entire site and basically use that as a garden. So we did a construction which would be this huge box containing all of the programs, the living room and the bedroom on top, where the box would be semi-sunken, and the living room would be then dominating and having the views over this land over here. The house, we are of course interested in the implementation of all this. Slovenia is still possible to have a lot of hand work on site, especially if you're willing to pay for it, but also it's not as expensive as here. So this house is basically cast completely in concrete, then hand polished, sanded and hand polished. So in a sense, it has a very, it doesn't have the smoothness or the perfection of the concrete that you would expect from this kind of Japanese, a kind of pudding style of concrete, but it has the roughness of concrete, which is at the same time been smoothened away. Towards the street, it actually does not have a fence that communicates, actually opens up towards the city condition with this general staircase. Once you get in, you're basically on top of this patio level, and you have a series of programs under you, but you also have this view of the outside space. The support system for the house are a few elements of program, like the kitchen or the fireplace are in fact indeed the columns that support the house. You go out and you go over this series of terraces and down into the lower part of the building. There are no fences. These people have an insurance which allows them to basically have a dead person on their property. But this was their vision. I think it also works very well with the house. The idea of use of glass, or this glass elevation, as a kind of something in which we then insert the window as a separate element. These windows are very deep. They are 60 centimeters deep, so they have this idea of transition in between the space of the house and the space of the outside world, which becomes then another space which we had in between, like in the old houses. The bottom floor, this kind of accumulation of something that our clients wanted to call a beach, some sort of very private place where they could have their suntans, swimming pool, workspace, and then a gym, and then a music space, and all the other spaces in the house. And these spaces are basically completely hidden from view. This is the so-called beach. The swimming pool, which has these 2 sheets of glass in between which you basically swim up and down, and you can go out there or go out there, and in the summer go out. The small garden in between, and then the workspace, and then the space of the gym, and then of course the bedroom condition on top. The bedroom on top turns around and catches the sun, the morning sun like this, and also once you go out of the bedroom, you orient yourself back to this big base of the program underneath. The idea of this kind of handmade details that we still try to carry out, where basically you can still find a few of these old people that can manage to execute some things with some sort of dedication to their own professions, not just assemble things. And in a sense, well, and of course the fact that this house happens in the city. We have done quite a few of these small boxes, small wooden houses, or small weekend houses for friends of ours, like the stone one that I showed you in the beginning, or this one which is very near this Bohinj lake, somewhere 1 hour from Ljubljana. It's in a national park, and this is the house of our client. This was his grandfather's house, which he inherited. It was completely rotten. We thought it was a very beautiful construction, until we heard from the local Monumentenzorg that we have to protect, that we have to keep the whole thing. And then we managed to convince them to replace it with exactly the same, volume. These were our early attempts to convince them that some more radical possibilities were there, but it didn't work. So in the end, this became our house. The weekend house has this bizarre aspect, as you all know, that you basically use it only for 2 or 3 days in a week or in a month, and for the rest it just sits and collects dust somewhere in the field. So in a sense we try to marry this condition of protection of this actual shape of the building with the idea of these mute containers in the field, so that the house in a way is traditional, but at the same time very mute, and it becomes animated only when you start using it. So the moment you arrive in the house, the windows will slide open, and there will also be these kind of weird conditions which will just indicate that this house is no longer the old house that it used to be. And you could start using it as a structure. The plan of the house, of course, is radically different from the traditional house, because it's basically the whole top floor is a continuous beam that goes around and sits on these 4 columns. You don't see it so much when you look at it from the outside, because of course the house on the outside is completely mute like this. But then when it starts getting used, you see these big cantilevers coming out and whatever. It explodes into a habitable unit. And works with the landscape, but then also is very easy to use and very easy to maintain. And the moment you leave, you can basically pack and go, and within let's say a 4 minutes or 5 minute period, this house was transformed back into this condition of a field container in the field on a Sunday evening. So why I'm insisting so much on these small houses is because, well, one thing is Belgium, but because I also think that a lot of the architectural ideas which we come back to in later projects will start their life on this kind of projects. So I have decided also to maybe conclude this talk with in a similar tone, with the project that we designed for a family with 4 kids who came to us, 4 little daughters, with a couple who actually lived together for 20 years, never had any children. And then, with the miracles of science, over a period of 2 years or 2.5 years, had 5 children, out of which 4 are still there. And basically, for them, they asked us to design a house for them, but for them the house was not about the site. This is the site, a totally anonymous suburban flat piece of land. For them, the house is not a site, not the idea of a site, and not the idea of actually living there, but the idea of living together, of being together in this kind of a new condition that they have managed to achieve. So we said, well, could it be then that this family of 6 could actually, as a condition, have only the dimension of this site, and that this idea of living together can indeed be the idea of living literally together at all times. Whether you could imagine, of course, this is a political project from the 60s, but so I'm dismissing the political note, but whether you could imagine the idea of being together and then separately at the same time, and let's say celebrating this life together at all times. So the house, which we have been accused that it looks like a kindergarten, or it looks like a car showroom, or it looks like whatever, but for us it mainly looks like what is inside. We are not interested so much in the way it expresses itself on the outside. It's basically a stick, 55 meters long, 5 meters wide, which is 1 room inhabited by 6 people. It's just basically a flat roof with the 4 little cabins for the 4 children, which are like on a boat, and a series of walls and panels that you can slide out and fold out, which allow you to also partition this house once the children start getting into their teens. The edges of the house are indeed the edges of the site, because this is where you planted the very strong greenery, and these are the so you can practically live on the whole plot of land. And the actual condition of the building site shows this. The building actually has conquered, or the whole little foundation have conquered the entire site that these people bought. So they initially thought that we were going to basically destroy their beautiful piece of land. The house is, as I said, constructed in concrete, in steel, because we wanted to have a structure which would be as light as possible and as easy as possible. It's not very used in Slovenia. And then again, as I said, sometimes we use this detailing like these flush windows and stuff like that to create not only to to kind of employ the people that have been doing these kind of things for many centuries, but all this knowledge is almost lost now. The house, as you see it from the fields, when you enter, you basically turn around, start walking, and then there is a series of sliding doors or sliding walls, which start opening up for one child, up for 2 and 3 children, and for the 4th child. So basically, the room completely connects. This is where parents sleep, only in this niche. And when you look back, you see the whole length of the house, the 55 meters, and in the end, this potential of this piece of, let's say, almost like a new plot, which to be conquered with the life that they're going to live together. The minimum boxes for the kids, which in turn, of course, can also be separated because you have these sliding panels or folding panels which will basically open up and allow for partitioning of the spaces once you do it. So that's why I said we were worried with this kind of modernist appearance of the house, because somehow the house is always, everybody looks at the facades and nobody really looks in the way it works. But then, when the children, when they moved into the house, they gave us these drawings. So every kid had to draw a house on the first day that they were living in a house for us, and they gave it to us as a present. And in the end, we were quite happy because we realized that despite the fact that there's maybe we had the problem of communicating with our fellow colleagues or with architects. In fact, the children understood very well and were able, at the age of 4, to kind of completely digest and project the very clear ideas about the house. And this is the kid of 6, basically, who is I think, slightly worse draftsman, who still had this idea of this very strong horizon and doors for every member of the family, or the 3rd kid, who was, I don't know how, maybe again 6, who actually had a merger of the two models, in a sense, trying to show that sometimes I think that we should also understand that architecture can truly mean something to people rather than just as be a means of communication to other architects. Thanks. I would actually like to stop at this point, and I'm open for your questions, but after I get the beer outside.